I'd like to welcome everyone to another in our ongoing series of science talks here at the Noyo Center. We typically present these programs in the Zoom format every month, although we are beginning to expand our programming to include some in-person science socials at our field station in Fort Bragg. So if you haven't joined us for one of those events, we hope you will soon. And we will, as always, keep you updated on all our events and our e-newsletters. And you can also check the website for all the current events and times and places and that sort of thing. Tonight, we have a guest in Jennifer Garrison, a senior environmental scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And her program tonight is going to explore some of the biodiversity of wildlife and plant series in Mendocino County and specifically on the coast. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Jennifer and let her tell you a little bit about her work and share her presentation tonight. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Trey. I would like to also thank the Noyo Marine Center for inviting me. This has been a long time coming, and thank you to Peggy Martin for being so persistent and getting me on the schedule and reminding me that I've been wanting to do this for almost 3 years. I am a senior environmental scientist at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm very proud to be in service to the resources and species of California, and I'm so excited to give you this talk tonight. So with that, I thought I would jump in and go from there. I'm going to turn off my camera because otherwise I can't see you anyway, and it gets a little confusing. So tonight, I want to talk to you and potentially challenge you about how you see your immediate world and how you see the world around you. I didn't plan to give a definition of what biodiversity is, but at its heart, biodiversity is the connected habitats and the number of species, individuals, that's abundance, and then how many species total occupy an area. We know that we live in a beautiful place. Mendocino County is a biodiversity hotspot within a hotspot that is California. And why is that? And it's because we have a variety of ecosystems and habitats. And we also have a relatively low human population with more rural and semi-rural communities than big urban centers. And so with that, I'm going to introduce a theory that you may be familiar with. And you're probably thinking, why are we going to talk about island biogeography if we're here to talk about, biodiversity on land? Well, here's why. In 1997, when I graduated from college, a friend of mine gave me a book called The Song of the Dodo. And the first few days after graduation, I laid on a trampoline in the backyard of my apartment, and I read this book front to back, immediately engrossed. And while I had studied the theory of island biogeography, it didn't hit me until I was reading this science book interpretation of what it could actually mean, because I was living in Ohio. I was landlocked. Island biogeography, that's for people who live near an ocean. That book, I don't think about it every day, but I think about it almost every day since I've graduated. And I joined the department in 2013, and almost every day, every moment, I have been driven to reconnect habitat and to sustain, increase by regenerating biodiversity. And so tonight's thought really is to have you think about this. We talk about fragmented habitats. We talk about destroyed habitats, degraded habitats. We hear on the news about our bird species and amphibian species plummeting. The insects are in peril. It gets very heavy. It feels like there's not a lot that an individual can do, but there's a lot we can all do. So the theory of island biogeography states that on a small island, there are fewer species, and they are more likely to experience extinction events because there aren't as many of them. So you've got genetic restriction. You also just have fewer species. You go to a slightly bigger island, and there's a few more species, and there's more of each of those species. And then travel back to the mainland, where you have the most amount of land available for species to roam, share their genetic material, and you also have a greater abundance of each one of those. I would like everyone to think about habitat fragmentation as islands. And that is what David Quammen had presented in this book that I had mentioned, The Song of the Dodo, and it really sticks with me. So, for a moment, I would like you to think about how you see your world, how we see our coast. The photo on the left is a image that was taken on the Navarro River. I was doing yellow-legged frog surveys. And I think when we think about a place that has lots of biodiversity, we think about places like that. Look at that beautiful water and those trees, and it just, wow, it's absolutely stunning and beautiful. But I'd also like you to think about this as a habitat and as a place that has biodiversity. And so that little wood pile is something I reconstructed for that little Incentina salamander that I found in my yard. I found him in my yard when I was pulling ivy off of my fence. And so the message, one of the messages tonight, is that I'd like you to see your yard as important habitat or potential habitat for some critter or suite of critters, and then potentially consider making improvements to that habitat into your yard to benefit those species. And then the second request for the night is I want you to pick one or two of the items. There's going to be 5 discussed here, and I would love for you to try them out. We are limited by our time, by our finances, by our physical ability to volunteer and get involved in our communities. But I think there's something in this presentation for everyone, a take-home message and an action that you're like, I could do that. I could try that on and see if it works for you. Oh, right. I forgot the rest of my photos. I apologize. This is also habitat. This is habitat. We tend to think of this being a little bit more of what we'd expect. And then my last photo for this slide is this is my yard. I decided when talking about invasive species and non-native species, I best should just stick to poking, nudging myself, because I certainly have a property that is dominated by non-native and invasive species that I work hard to eradicate. The takeaway message. I tend to put my conclusions at the beginning of my presentations, helps keep me focused, but it also gets you guys to, bought into what this idea that I'm attempting to share for the night. And so the takeaway message is to keep common species common, which is a mantra phrase that a colleague who retired from the department about 10 years ago, he told me. His name is Mark Stouffer, a brilliant scientist with the department who was so dedicated. And I thought when I first came to the department, part of my job was to save and protect the listed species, and it is. But maybe my biggest purpose is to keep common species common, keep animals moving on the landscape, keep the habitats healthy. I put in a think globally, act locally. I think a lot of us may have had this bumper sticker on our cars in college, but it's a great reminder that there's a lot going on in the world. But if we act locally, we can make a difference. But it gets a little overwhelming. And so I pose a question to you. And whenever I get overwhelmed with the sheer amount of invasive species on my property that I'm attempting to eradicate, or when the world seems darker because of my job and the things that we see. So, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Make a plan, identify the problem, make a plan, and take a bite out of it every single day. So I think the first thing that I would ask everybody to do is to get hooked on your natural world. And there's all sorts of different ways to do this, but I find the best way is to start with what you know. So identify the species you interact with the most. And there are online guides that you can key, i.e., identify species. I put a big asterisk here and say, please always confirm your identification with a credible source, because a lot of the apps that are available they are actually AI driven. And while that's great and wonderful for lots of different ways, I tried to use AI for this presentation to create a great image for me. And instead, it created an infinity symbol of a red-sided garter snake, which I couldn't obviously use. So confirm your sources. And if you can't confirm it online, then there are people like myself and others, people, almost any scientist who will help you identify whatever you're looking at. I would say, you know, start a yard list. That's what I did. I moved onto a property that had been abandoned for several years and had tons of invasive species. And so as I began to do work and pulling up some of that ivy, I actually found that the native species started to come back. I have to keep those invasives knocked back, or they overtake and outcompete the natives. But start a yard list, and then just like birders do, who go out and do bird lists, consider starting to expand when you check your yard, and then expand to your favorite place, your favorite hiking spot, your favorite headland spot. There's all sorts of opportunities I'll talk about more that you can go out and participate with the local groups to participate in different particularly bird surveys. But know your world. And the best way to do that is to learn your species. I encourage everyone also, by the way, to learn the scientific names, because what you and I may call one thing, someone else and someone else will call it four different other things. So really being able to find the scientific name, you don't always have to pronounce it. I screw that up all the time, but at least be able to point back to the scientific name. The next one is as critical as the first, which is identify invasive species. Learn them, the aquatic ones, the terrestrial ones, the plant ones. And it's easy to start with the ones that are already present, because you see them, you can see them in their different life forms, and you can become familiar with them. But I also say, then move on to the ones, or prioritize, in my case on my property, the ones that cause the most damage to native habitats and wildlife. And I didn't put too much of this into the presentation, but I do want to just briefly talk about aquatic invasive species, and I'll do that on slides that are coming up soon. So where do you learn these things? Well, the internet and apps are amazing resources. Most of these are California centric. So I just want to kind of give you a little bit of rundown on all of them. The California Native Plant Society has something called Calscape, and the tagline to it is restoring nature one garden at a time. And it's a great place to go and look for different species. There's also an inner app that you can put in your zip code, and you can figure out what plants may be recommended to be planted there, with a little asterisk that we live in a place with a bunch of different microclimates, and not everything wants to live exactly where these apps say that they should. So please be mindful of that. The next is CalHERPS. You want to know where the California Department of Fish and Wildlife scientists, when someone sends them a photo and says, "What do you think this is?" Well, if we don't know what it is, then we often open up CalHERPS if it's going to be a frog or a different kind of reptile. It's a wonderful resource. It has photographs first from multiple counties. And so, the Encetinas in Mendocino look a little different than the ones in Humboldt. Same for yellow-legged frogs. There are ones that are red variants and ones that actually don't have yellow legs. That's another bit, I'm sure you know that, but they don't actually have yellow legs. So it's a great place to look at photos first. But then more important to that, there are keys that say which way are their irises oriented. If it's this way, it could be this. If it's that way, it's this. So it leads you down a decision-making tree to be able to identify what species you have. And also very important is it provides range maps for all the different species. So, if you think you have a I don't even want to suggest what kind of venomous snake, but we don't have any here, by the way, on the coast. But if you key something and it only lives in the Mojave Desert, there's a good chance you need to go back to the key and look at it again on the off chance. that it's not an escapee and you just miskeyed it. CalFlora, much like CalScape, also a great resource. What I love about CalFlora is that it too has a bunch of different photographs, and this one's really more geared towards scientists, meaning like it has the bloom times for the species, it has the range height, it has their different descriptions of different habitats, and then there's actually dots on a map that you can go and explore where other scientists and then you can pull up their records to see where they may have, where these different species may have been found. It's free. All of these are free with the exception of the Department of Fish and Wildlife Natural Diversity Database. CNDDB is a subscription-based service, but it's free to it's free to upload data. And for the next ones, when we move into these phone apps, iNaturalist and Seek, those are great applications, but they're not peer reviewed. And so you need to, with Seek, it's also AI driven. So again, always check your source and check again for, another source for confirmation of a species, but for, recognizing that they're not peer reviewed. And so what is peer reviewed is the data that goes into the natural diversity database that CDFW maintains. And it is for a suite of species that are listed species or species that are considered rare, or like in California, we have species of special concern, which means it's the next step down from listing, that we really want to work on the recovery and sustaining these species and hopefully expanding their abundance. Again, keeping common species common, doing what we can to improve the habitat. And of course, that all leads back to all of us, not just the department. So iNaturalist is great. Seek is great. If you don't know your plants that well, you can scan them, you can look at things, it'll tell you what it might be. Your iPhone does that too, by the way. If you pull up a photo, swipe up, it'll say look up plant. I've also had it tell me things that do not live here, don't even live on this continent. So word to the wise, always check twice. My favorite app on this list is the Merlin Bird ID from Cornell. I've started a bird list for my own property, and so you can open it up and you can it records whoever's chirping and it tells you what it is. And that's really wonderful because there are actually bird species that migrate that have come into my yard that I probably would not have even noticed had I not been, had an app where I could open it up, hear what the bird chirp is, and then have it identified. You can also save bird lists in there, which I find incredibly helpful. So with that, that's that suite. So number 2, let's move into the direct action. Tackle invasive species problem. And if you don't know that there's an invasive species problem, there it is. I hate to break it to you, but it's not just here, it's everywhere. And so often, some plants that we love or that people love, they're invasive. This is a photo that I took out on the Mendocino Headlands. And what I'd like to call out about the photo is that you see the ice plant and you can see a little bit of bracken fern coming up here or there. But other than that, this is a monoculture. This is a habitat that is dominated by an invasive species, but it wasn't always like that. I tend to be a little loose on occasion between non-native and invasive. I want to be clear that invasive species are species that come onto the landscape outside of their known distribution range, and they establish themselves, and they tend to do it very quickly, almost before you even knew they were there. They're everywhere. Non-native is a step below that, but I tend to think about get the ones that are the worst, i.e. invasive, and then also knowing the positive effect of native plants on our ecosystem. I tend to look past the non-natives and think, what else can I plant? So I hear a lot of things when I go out into the field. I do a lot of coastal development project site visits that have been referred to me by the County of Mendocino. And I'm very passionate about invasive species targeting and planting natives. And so every landowner, every county planner, all the consultants on the coast are very familiar with a lot of the things I'm saying because I say it a lot. And it seems so simple, but it will have such a big impact if we all double down, target invasive species. So the first thing I hear is, but it's so pretty. I totally hear you. There are a lot of really beautiful invasive species, and there's some current research that states that the phrenology of these pretty plants is actually meant so that we will help them move beyond their existing ranges. Not enough to be able to say more or cite it, but I thought it was an interesting idea. The other is that when I start talking about some of this, landowners are like, I had no idea how bad this plant was or this species. If it's a wildlife species, like, say, American bullfrog, which is non-native to California, it decimates our amphibian populations, or feral pigs, which can do massive damage to habitats. So, yeah, I didn't know how bad it was either until I bought a property that is overrun by invasives. So, over here on the top right, here's one of, it's not technically listed as an invasive. It's called Crosima. I'm mispronouncing that because it's how I learned how to say it, but apparently it's Croxima. This is my Labrador Retriever standing in this, in a back portion of my yard. It comes out, it's pretty easy to pull. It's got a bulb, but of course other bulbs break off and stay in the ground. But this is me not attending to this section of the yard for about 6 months. And my Labrador, he's one of those tall varieties. So he's not a small dog. He's 100 pounds and, oh, I'm going to guess about 32 inches tall. This is what happens when species escape landscaping. The bottom right photo was taken farther south in our county, closer to Manchester, and that is the beautiful calla lily, made famous, of course, by some murals by Diego Rivera. We love the calla lily, but it doesn't belong here. But in this photo, what is so hard to see is that those calla lilies have completely overtaken and matted at the root level a drainage, a water course. And so it is preventing native species from growing. But there's other issues with invasives beyond just that they outcompete natives. And the first I would say is that, so this is capeweed. This is another one I often rant about. Um, this is a yard that is also kind of close to Mendocino. Just take a moment and look at the ground. You can see a little bit of a patch of dirt over towards the bottom left of the photo, but the rest of it, even if you were to zoom in, it's going to be difficult for you to see any other plant species coming up through that massive amount of yellow and the roots. It creates a mat, and it really truly does create this monoculture. And it's prolific. It loves to serve soil, as most invasives do. And so when something like this starts, you start seeing one or two, you think, can't be that bad. It is, because this is what happens. And back to the calla lily. So this is another site I was on. I was on this site, 2.5, 3 years ago. And it is a piece of land that was on and off, has been grazed. But when I saw it several years ago, it it looked like it had been grazed, but it didn't look like this. And so this was last week. I show up, and it is just covered in wild radish. And wild radish is a species that has a taproot. It's pretty easy to pull out at certain times of year, but wow, is it a prolific spreader of its seed. And so infestations like this, it'll take serious effort to be able to knock this back and to be able to allow for native species to come up. Again, I would challenge you, if you were to look, be able to zoom in on the photo, you would see that there are very few, if no, other species that even come close to a codominant in this type of infestation. This is a wetland. It's a seasonal wetland near Mendocino, and I would just like to call out the plants for a moment. Um, there is a foxglove growing. You can see all that white in the background. That is more radish. We have poison hemlock. You may think, oh, it's not that bad. Oh, it's bad. It's extremely bad. The best part going to this seasonal wetland is there are a few native herb and wetland plants that are growing, and there's some California, including California blackberry. But for the most part, if this wetland is not maintained, meaning gone in, pull these species out by hand, it's going to, all these invasive species are literally going to take over this wetland, which is going to severely reduce its habitat value for a full suite of species. Pick a species and here on the coast, and there's a good chance it will reduce its habitat. You can also see some very lovely English ivy growing up in the top left. And then beyond that, that spot of yellow, of course, is one of our favorites invasives here on the coast. It's broom. So one of the things that while preparing for this presentation, I was looking up about invasive plant species. And I was a little surprised to find out that approximately 42% of species that are now deemed to be invasive by the California Invasive Plant Council are they escaped from landscaping. So whether it was they got brought home in a pot from a nursery or someone planted them and then they escaped off that property, I don't think that people realize that the cultivated species that they buy primarily at big box stores, how bad they are for our native habitats. And going back to, but they're so pretty, I challenge you to any day of the week to be able to find a species, a native California species that you don't think is just as pretty as some of these. And also, foxglove, I let some of these, invasives, including that one, are toxic to our dogs if you have those. Um, but let's dig a little deeper. No pun intended. This invasive species impact soil quality. Some invasive plant species can actually change the chemistry of the soil that then prevents or severely impacts native species' abilities to grow. And you saw the photo of the capeweed with it deeply matted. Well, that's a good example of one, it just prevents growth from coming up. But what's it doing subsurface? And so ice plant, it absorbs water. A lot of invasives absorb water. It makes it very heavy. And then one thing that I have been just starting to do some research. The research isn't great on it, but there's more coming out every day, is about how invasive species plants increase erosion. And so when we think about our local creeks and streams and rivers, and then people, landowners who want to use the full amount of their property build closer towards the creek, and then that usually means riparian trees get cut down, native vegetation is probably removed, and then invasives move in. And some people want to keep creeks beds cleared of vegetation because they think that it's preventing erosion, but it's not. Having native species on creek beds in the riparian zone, replanting our riparian areas actually improves erosion. Non-natives and invasives contribute to erosion because they also have smaller, not as deep roots, which then allows them, they're not able to hold on to the soil, that allows the soil to escape, which then adds sediment to our waterways, which can lower dissolved oxygen. And for all of our native species, it can also just reduce water quality for us humans. And so that's a problem. Then the next bit, also more new science, is the effect of invasive species on the intensity of wildfires. And this, there's not a great deal. There's only a couple of years, about the last 5 years or so, of better research. But I do want to call out the California Native Plant Society has written a really great booklet about fire, how species react after fire. And it's not just for natives that tend to some resprout because of fire, but worse because it's disturbed because of vehicles coming in and out to fight the fire. There could be a lot of invasive species that hitchhike in for these fires and come up after. And so they're talking about that. They're also talking about the benefit of native species over invasive species to fight wildfire. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is sustaining what we have for native species and regenerating biodiversity through planting of natives after or as we continue to target invasive species. So a few things: identify them and figure out a way to contain them. There's lots of different resources out there about how to contain invasives. I think herbicide, we all know that herbicide's problematic, but the department recognizes there are occasions in which herbicide is appropriate. All of those are a case by case basis. For landowners, I would encourage you all to research the different options you have, and that's case by case on the individual invasive species that is present. Then next, and by the way, it's not a year thing, it's not a 2-year thing. Right now, I'm thinking about a 5 to 6-year plan for my own property to deal with invasives. You have to keep going and keep going and keep tending to them. So choosing natives for your landscaping, that's one of the best things you can do to just simply combat and avoid some of these invasions. And then when you see invasive species coming up, you got to target them and target them quickly, because otherwise, the longer you wait, the harder and more expensive and challenging it is to get them eradicated. And honestly, we say eradication, but it's not. A local biologist, he once reminded me that it isn't eradication, it's just targeting, because getting rid of some of these once established is nearly impossible. And when you think of it in that way, your island just got a lot smaller with very little hope to make it big again. So finding those infestations, targeting them, and then again, choosing your natives. A really important point to be made here is about following protocols so that you leave behind any hitchhiker seeds or aquatic organisms. And so this means a forestry colleague of mine said, bag your boots, take them off when you're in the field, bag them, wash them later, but don't spread invasive species through your truck tires and through your field gear. And this is particularly important for those of us who go into creeks because, amphibians are struggling, fish species are struggling. We do not want to introduce any potential pathogens or invasive aquatic species between watersheds. And so it seems like such a, you're really going to make me do that? Yeah, you should. And you should do it every time. I have dropped 2 documents, by the way, into the chat. One of them is just a resource list that I made for anyone because I'm talking about a bunch of different things. You may be like, oh, I want more information on that. Well, I provided some references for you where you can just go and dig in. And one of those includes links to CDFW and also to the federal agencies for protocols to reduce the spread of aquatic organisms. We're lucky here on the coast in that our waterways have not been invaded as severely as some in the valley. And so there's some really great protocols put out by the department. And I believe the tagline is drain it, dry it, wash it. And so this applies to kayakers and other boats and obviously larger vessels. I'm not in the marine division, so I'm not qualified to talk about that. But there is a link on that reference list to contact CDFW. It's a general email address if you think you have observed those invasive aquatic species. And I hate to say it, but it's a matter of time. So this goes back to the know how to identify them and be able to contain the appearance and spread of any of these aquatic species as well as these plant species. And then when it all seems like I've said a whole lot and there's so much to be done, and it starts to feel a little overwhelming, I want to remind you about the elephant. One bite at a time, one step at a time, slowing down a little bit, being more thoughtful than you have been in the past, that I've been in the past, and think about ways to prevent the spread of these species. Right. So this is a great photo. This is taken on the Mendocino coast, just north of the village of Mendocino. It's a little turnout just on the southern edge of Russian Gulch. What I love about this photo is that we're all battling beach and cliff erosion. And this photograph, to some, may say, oh, wow, it just looks like a little bit of a landslide there. What I really want to call out is the pampas grass in the foreground. And I want to call out the Scotch broom in the upper part of the photo against the ocean. And so when we are thinking about how our terrestrial world meets our aquatic world, all of this matters. Once it starts to take a run down the slopes, it's a lot harder to get it back. And because our cliffs are so steep, treatment becomes extremely difficult. So I don't know who planted pampas grass on the coast 100 years ago or however long, but it is here to stay. And now the best we can do is find the appropriate treatments for it, which for a lot of invasive species is go find its bloom period and then cut it off before it starts to bloom. So it can't create seed and it can't cast its seed. And then it just becomes like a hand pulling or weed whacking or mowing exercise. But again, each species specific, what the best way to treat it. But there is hope that we can reel it back in. In instances like this, I'm not going to say that the beach erosion is occurring because of the invasive species, but I certainly can say that the beach cliff is not benefiting from having these invasive species instead of the native species that typically would grow on those cliffs. Ah, this one is not yet on a list. I wish we were all in the same room together and you could raise your hand and tell me if you'd seen this. So this starts to show up. This is sourgrass. It's an oxalis. It starts to show up some late January, early February. A friend of mine years ago, visiting from Ohio, I was brand new to California. I've been here 26 years, been here only a couple years, and he and I would see some friends in Berkeley. And the person's backyard in Berkeley was covered in this very delicate, cute little yellow flower with leaves that look a lot like the clover. And I remember remarking, oh, that is so cute. And the homeowner turned to me and said, it's not cute at all. It is completely taken over my yard. So that's 2002, 2003. Fast forward to when I was living in Sacramento, it definitely was making its way into our backyard and it outcompetes native ground covers. It outcompetes most things. And the problem with it is that it is so prolific in the way it's able to spread its seeds. And so before you know it, you have a problem. And then it tends to cast its seed and desiccate when you're not really paying attention. So it starts when it's kind of wet and rainy around here. None of us are really truly thinking about mowing our lawns and weed whacking. And then next thing you know, it is spread across your entire yard. I don't know how, but this species also made its way onto my property in the last 2 years. And it will be a challenge probably for the next decade to hit it and keep hitting it. I weed whack it to the bare ground and then I cast other seeds in the fall. And it's my hope that eventually I will be able to get enough native cover to at least suppress it. But again, it creates a monoculture. Monocultures are bad. More monoculture, less diversity of species, and poor soil health. So with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about invasive species to target and non-natives to avoid. So this is a photo of one of the bluff top properties I was on recently. It has a succulent on it. Anybody watching knows the name of the succulent. I'd love to know what it is because I'd love to be able to make wanted posters to rip it out everywhere. Um, this is a road cut. Well, that's what you're looking at, is that you can see where the tree is leaning. You can see that the ground comes toward you in the foreground, and then it's a road cut. And at some point, someone on the property cut this kind of path between the ocean and the rest of their property. And you can see the exposed rock. There's a fair amount of bishop pine cover, which is great, but it's not holding in the soil. You can see a few bracken fern spread about, but also you can see some English ivy, one of my most hated species, and then the succulent. And I'm sure the succulent was planted because they were thinking erosion, rock, pretty, but you can see roots exposed. And then I wish I'd taken a photo of what it looked like at my feet, which was just sloughing of the slope. The next photo, this one, I've simply turned 90 degrees to look at that rock slope, road cut again. And this is what I see. I can see bracken fern. I can see my favorite California native. This is a prostrate horizontal variety of ceanothus, also known as California lilac. What I'd like you to notice, if I go back between the two, that's the face of that slope. Now I've turned and looked at my left, and that's the face of that. Notice the lack of erosion. Ceanothus is, it likes dry slopes, it likes poor soils, but notice that it is holding on to the side of this road cut. Also, look at the diversity of the species that are growing through there. They're not all native, but certainly better than the other photos. And this actually, there's a good chance because it's not dominating, it's allowing for other natives to come up. So, top 12 to avoid. Ice plant. It's everywhere. It's a photo I showed you in the beginning out on the cliffs. Ironically, it was planted by the Army Corps of Engineers up and down California and probably other places, I'm not sure, many decades ago to actually help with cliff erosion. But what we have found is that, of course, they have very shallow roots and they become so heavy that they may actually contribute to additional pressures on the bluffs. More science needs to be done on that. But we certainly can say that it creates a monoculture. It's not providing any kind of roots to anchor any of that soil, which just makes it problematic. It also completely smothers some really amazingly awesome rare plants that grow in dune habitats, and also some really great natives that are not yet rare and hopefully will not be. But when you literally go and pull the ice plant up, the roots are very shallow, and then the next season natives come out. And that's the magic of targeting invasive species. You get your native species to come up, and if those plants come up, if they are hosts to any kind of insects, then on and on and on we go for biodiversity, abundance of individuals, and increased numbers of species in those habitats. Second, pampas grass, please don't ever buy it. Please don't ever plant it. Anytime you see it, I'm not encouraging trespassing, please don't do that. But if you have it on your property, knock it back. Find ways to remove this from spreading. Cotoneaster. There are biologists and county planners who I work with weekly who are probably tired of me talking about cotoneaster. I am not a fan. It has these little red berries, and everyone thinks, oh, well, that's probably good for bird food. It's not. They don't eat the berries because they can't eat the berries because they're poisonous. So it can be a small shrub. It can grow up to a much larger shrub, what you would think of a very nice, mature rhododendron. But it has very little value, if none, actually, on the landscape, other than taking up space and habitat from natives that do contribute to the diversity by providing either food source or cover for other natives. Capeweed, that's the yellow one I showed you before. Gosh, give it an inch and it'll take a year and the whole place will be covered in it. There are several infestations when you drive up and down Highway 1. Now that you know what you're looking for, if you weren't already familiar with the species, you'll see it and you'll see it spreading And then several months before that, in the same places, you'll see oxalis growing because apparently they don't mind sharing that because they have different periods. Wild radish, again, dominates the landscape. Deep taproot vegetation knocks back the ability for other things to grow. Great way to, create a monoculture. I've heard it's edible, haven't tried it. Always read your science journals and field guides on edibility of plants, but wouldn't it be great if someone could find a way to use it? Periwinkle. It's one of my favorite colors, one of my least favorite plants. It will dominate a landscape in no time. Has these cute blue, purple flowers, deep, shiny green leaves. These are plants that you go, wow, that's a really beautiful plant. It is. But it also creates habitat um, monoculture. It reduces because it tends to grow. It has a wide variety of places it'll grow, but the places I've seen it have the most impact is where it's starting to take over seasonal wetlands. And then that, who knows how it's changing the soil composition, but it certainly is reducing because it's so tangly, the ability for species to be able to use that wet resource for water or to forage for food. Um, it suppresses native plants from growing. Pride of Madeira. I know everybody loves this. Drive through Irish Beach, everyone loves Pride of Madeira. If I never seen another one of these again, it would make me a very happy biologist. Same with Tree of Heaven. Heather. People love heather. And it's another species that there's all sorts of different stories about how it came here along with gorse, which is not on this list simply because I couldn't bring myself to do it. But again, don't ever plant it. Do whatever you can to eradicate it. Community effort. I know that there were some people trying to get grants to attend to it. But heather, I guess I just look at it and think, why would you plant that if there are so many better natives that actually provide habitat for other native species? And, with that in mind, then you no longer look at heather and you go find something better. Last but not least are species that are native to California. And this is going to come up a little later when I talk about native plants, but they're native to California. One is actually a quote unquote rare plant, meaning it's got a plant rank of rarity in Monterey County, but it's not native here. And it's been planted here for generations. And it outcompetes the native trees. It also can be susceptible to disease brought in by another favorite landscape plant called the Leland cypress. And if the Leland cypress is infected, it can also infect these Monterey species. So, yes, they're great. They have shallow roots. They don't fare well. They, with age, we have our bishop pine. It does not already have a long lifespan and also has susceptibility to disease. But at the end of the day, I would rather plant the native, and this non-native just does not support the wildlife, and then it just becomes a hazard tree. So with that tagline, locally appropriate native species. Anyone who's heard me talk on a site visit will hear me say this repeatedly. The key to being able to sustain and regenerate biodiversity is through the planting of native plants. If you aren't planting the locally appropriate natives or cultivars that have been cultivated for the purposes of growing here, you are doing a disservice to yourself, to your yard, to your back when you're out pulling invasive species because they've let everything else run wild, or worse, spending a lot of money on a native that then just dies. There's some general landscaping tips and tricks you should probably check out about water need and sun need, but at the end of the day, local native species want to grow where they are meant to grow. So native to the coast. Again, one of my favorite things that I've heard a landowner say to me in the last couple of months. This landowner had planted some Monterey cypress and fairly large trees, which I'm sure were quite expensive. And I said, well, why didn't you consider planting the other bluff top trees that grow here, like say Bolander pine? And he looked at me, and he's facing me, and behind him, about 60 feet, is a very healthy looking Bolander pine. And he says, I didn't plant them because natives don't grow well here. I hear that a lot. Yes, sometimes native take longer time to grow, and that can be for a full suite of reasons, including soil nutrients. Actually, one of our sensitive natural communities here on the coast, it's the Mendocino cypress woodland. It is the rarest of the rarest vegetation in the world, with a global rank of G1 and a state rank of S1. If you don't know what those are, head on over to the manual of California vegetation and learn a little bit about natural communities, and if when in the future there's a opportunity to have more talks about natural communities and plants growing in communities, not just as individuals, I'd love to do that. But this vegetation for the Mendocino cypress woodland, one of the reasons it's classified as these associations is because it's growing in a nutrient poor soil. There are Mendocino cypresses that are 100 years old, but they may only be 5 to 6 feet. And so going back to general natives, they tend to like poor soil. They tend to grow slower. They do not want soil amendments. Please do not go give native plants soil amendments. And because they grow in areas they're used to the climate, and so therefore you plant in the fall, you wait for the rains. And if you don't do that, there's supplemental watering and you can potentially kill them. As with our first species, I went ahead and put down just the common, but California lilac, back to Ceanothus, my favorite. I have a series of tables I want to show you, and all of them are from Homegrown National Park with Doug Tallamy, who is currently doing his Bringing Back the Natives Garden Tour 2025. Head to that link, and you can watch a bunch of different presentations he's been giving on a lot of the things that I am talking about. And it's actually a lot of his work that inspires a lot of my work these days. I saw him speak 7 years ago in LA at a native plant conference. And what blew me away is he put up a photograph of a yard with bird feeders, like literal bird feeders, and all these beautiful ornamental trees. Think ginkgo, who was East Coast, big lawn. And then he showed a slide right after that of what that looks like to birds. And it was a wasteland. It was empty. So I would first let you know I did not put all these charts together, but thank Doug Tallamy for them, because in a few very simple charts, he really drives home how important it is to plant native species for biodiversity. One, yards in urban areas and semi-urban areas by acreage comprise more land than all of the conserved land in the United States, including all the state parks, all the national forests, all the national parks, the city green spaces, and the open spaces. So that means that yards, your yard, whether you be located in downtown Fort Bragg or out on 2 acres like I am, that's all potential habitat that has become lost over time because primarily of the homogeneous nature of the plants that are now occupying those spaces. Again, big plug for planting locally appropriate species. And this is the next point, gets to why I have these tables. Native plants support native larval insects, and those larvae are what feed baby birds. I think in the last 10 years, I'm very thankful for the movements where people talk about planting pollinator species and water-wise, they're drought-tolerant plants. Well, we need to move beyond that conversation, because a lot of, if not all, native species contribute some way positively to the environment. There is an asterisk on that, that there are some problematic species who just get a little crazy and run a little wild, but we forgive them because they contribute in other ways. But for the most part, native species are providing food for baby birds. Baby birds do not eat birdseed. Adult birds probably shouldn't eat a lot of birdseed either because that's not their diet. But we all run through the Taco Bell drive-through on occasion. So we move on. We say, okay, noted, good. But to feed our native species, we need native insects. And so it all kind of goes back to the smallest level here, talking about those insects. So on this table, I put up a list. These are from 2 tables that he put together for a talk that he just did in San Francisco. So he made Northern California Bay Area lists, and then he put them in a couple of columns. One was, all the kind of species, scientific names, and families, but I've cut those out just so I could make them big enough for the slide. The middle column is an H, is it an herb? W, is it a woody shrub? And then the right column are the number of native insects that lay their larvae on these native plants. So I'm calling out California lilac, my favorite, 117 different native insects lay their larvae on California lilac. Maple, 116. Huckleberry, Vaccinium ovatum, 106. Rose, native rose. Himalayan blackberry, native blackberry. Or, still up there pretty high, 94. Let's drop down the list. Excuse me. Bacchus, 37. Rhododendron, azaleas, Labrador tea, pretty common here on the coast, 37. At the very bottom, Indian paintbrush, which is a native annual that you would expect to see out on those bluffs that I showed you are overrun by capeweed and other species. Indian paintbrush, we call it Mendocino coast paintbrush now. I apologize, I did not catch that while doing my tables. And the next is yarrow. We're down to 19 species. So you go, okay, well, that didn't seem like so many native species. So let's take a look at non-natives. Pampas grass, one native moth, butterfly, knows that it can lay its larva on pampas grass. Going down through the list, you can see the ones that I've mentioned before, and you can start to understand why I don't like these species for the effect of what they have on native insects, which is they remove not only their ability to reproduce, but also it just restricts their habitat. So again, we're down to smaller islands. And then we have, again, of course, this idea that bird populations are struggling worldwide. Why make it worse for them by planting non-natives that they can't get foods from? So calla lily, again, everyone loves those. I totally get it. But 3, Spanish broom, 2. Now, just kind of run through the list. Nasturtium, we all love the nasturtium. It's a little better. Let's drop down to the 3 that I've highlighted: crabgrass, Bermuda grass, and dandelion. Dandelion, our common weed, the one that people spend a lot of time trying to eradicate out of their beautiful green lawns. 44 native species. And while that's not no ceanothus, that's still a lot more than even some natives give. Bermuda grass, crabgrass, 2 things that we're like, oh, we hate those. Well, people who have lawns, I do not really have a lawn. People who have lawns, oh, we want to cut these out, oh, whatever the case may be. Please notice these are the species that provide support native insects to lay their larvae, are also some of the ones that people target to move out of their yards, while also planting things like coreopsis and lavender. I'm not going to throw too much shade on that because I'm a big fan of lavender, but again, pick your species, keep it contained. Now, here's another list. This is the one that I find most powerful. we can just kind of run through it. When people talk about, but it's a pollinator. This conversation is so much bigger than just talking about pollinators. And so borage, it's a non-native people, but it's a slightly beneficial, may or may not have medicinal properties, but notice it provides no support for natives. Same for bamboo, same for corn lily, same for ice plant, bent grass, those red hot pokers that everyone plants, rock rose. People love rock rose for landscaping. Zero benefit to native species. That means zero benefit, zero food for baby birds. And there is a statistics out there that you can go and find from Doug Tallamy, who says something like a mama robin to raise 4 baby robin chicks, it takes over 3,000 larva grubs to raise that nest. When you start removing native species for which birds get their food, you're removing the future of our species diversification and abundance for birds as well as others. Montebretta here, I just want to call out, that's um, the plant that was growing around my dog Scout, who everyone loves because it also again has these bright orange flowers, but no good, very little to no benefit. So let's move forward. Let's talk about good stuff. How do we improve wildlife movement? This is our 4th category. It is building on the idea that if you plant natives, then you are reconnecting habitat, so making those small islands a bigger island. And with that, you're allowing species to move, and that is enabling, genetic diversity, so spread of genes, it's abundance and diversity of species. And so that's our goal. And every single person can do it. That's the beautiful bit, whether you have a tiny garden or you have a larger plot of land, we can all help regenerate biodiversity by reconnecting habitat areas to make these islands bigger, which then does drop the potential, or I should say, the percent effect of the likelihood of extinction. This little bit was provided on the template that the department provides to us for PowerPoints, and I just thought it was so powerful. I wanted to leave that because it's also another big part of this is that when we constrain, when habitat fragmentation happens, we're back on a small island, then there's going to be increased human wildlife conflict. And of course, there are plenty of things you can do. One of the documents I dropped into the chat actually has a link to CDFW's Reducing Human Wildlife campaign and just gives some really good practical tips to reduce interaction with wildlife. One tip that's not on that link, by the way, is to use motion sprinklers to encourage species not to be in your yard for, to reside there, which I've personally used with a mountain lion on my property. He showed no concern about the lights. He was not a big fan of the sprinklers. And so I haul them out every time he decides, maybe I'll give it another go on her place and see if she'll let me stay. No, but having said that, I have made modifications to my property to have it be a pass through, to have it be a corridor. So taking a moment back, I just want to say everywhere is home for some critter. Everywhere. Your yard, under your front stairs, in my back 40, whatever the case may be, everywhere is home. I have a spider who thinks he wants to live in my Jeep. I don't prefer that, but sure. Species have home ranges that scale from your yard that extend for miles. And so in front of me is a banana slug. This was taken in my yard at a section that I call the quote unquote intersection because a lot of animals come and go out of this intersection, including myself and my 2 Labrador retrievers, as well as I've seen a bobcat, I've seen a deer walk down it, and multiple banana slugs on and on. It's the point of that some animals aren't going to move through your yard and keep going. Some species live in your yard. And if you provide better habitat for them by planting things like natives, and more importantly, ripping out the invasives and replanting with natives, you'll see their abundance increase and you'll see the diversity increase. So one of the things I think that I get asked a lot, because I used to give a lot of talks on wildlife connectivity, well, can't the department map wildlife movement corridors? And the answer is no, because animals are opportunistic. And so therefore, where they move and how they move is going to change depending upon the different environmental and human threats and pressures that are applied. Widening a road, increasing a speed limit, putting up a guardrail, all of these different things can actually change how an animal will move across a roadway. Which reminds me, see, all sorts of different, this is a photo that's actually taken up on the sand dunes really close to my house. And, everybody's going somewhere, everywhere you look. And so one of the things I did at my property is that I modified my existing fence by cutting sections out of the privacy fence at the bottom. And they're not spaced exactly, but about every 20 to 30 feet. And the bigger animals just jump my gate, such as the mountain lion. But why I was inspired to do this is I heard an animal in distress one day, and I hadn't lived here very long. And I go outside of the gate, and I'm watching a mama fox who obviously has young because of the size of her teeth, is stuck up against this privacy fence. So instead, I just opened the gate and she ran through my yard and then up onto a sand dune. I think she lives up there. So it became my goal to increase movement through my property. I don't necessarily need or want a mountain lion to live on my property. However, I recognize that that species is just trying to get from timberlands a little farther to the east of me, up and over Highway 1, and then up on the sand dune where there is abundant food provided via deer. Modifying fences, there's lots of different wildlife friendly fence designs. I would really encourage everyone to consider them. I recognize that fences are used to keep species out, including humans, but there are modifications that can be made that make it unlikely for a human to want to climb the fence, but that will allow wildlife movement, whether it's the smaller mammals under or over. Creating native vegetation areas and strips to guide the wildlife through your yard is really important. It's kind of in a way, like a message of, hey, go this way because it's got the native vegetation. Therefore, the species is more inclined to go through there. One of the things I didn't include in the native plant slide that I was showing you with native species is that the list that Doug Talmy put out for the Bay Area, it actually showed that besides natives, behind natives, the next group of plants that native insects will lay their larvae is on your vegetable garden. So if you don't want these native larvae to eat your veggies and your plants, perhaps plant other things for them to lay their larvae on, which will then just start a cascading effect of birds coming in. Things may want to eat the birds, and then things may want to eat whatever just ate the bird. And you're creating these movement corridors, connecting habitats for not only the species, improving them for the species that live within your yard, your quote unquote movement corridor, but also those that are truly passing through. The next bit, this is Highway 20. The University of California, Davis has the Roadcology Center. Much like other state agencies, University of California, Davis is tracking roadkill. And so one of the things that you can do is when you see roadkill, write it down, think about it, or save it in your mind, however you're going to do it. Then head on over to UC Davis Roadkill Ecology and stay where you were. If you have a photo, great, but of course drive safely, pull off the side of the road, do all of that. But you can report these things. You can also report wildlife incidents to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I also provided a link for that in the document that is in the chat. And that is just for reporting problems with wildlife. And that could be anything from a deer stuck in a fence to another injured species to one dead on the road, or if you're having a species that has become problematic, an individual for a multitude of nuisance reasons. The next is to lobby on a local, county, and state level for wildlife connectivity actions. There's a lot of actions. It doesn't have to be $100 million overpass over 101, which we love in LA to help our mountain lions that have become genetically restricted, but it can be upsizing culverts. It can be putting in fencing that actually encourages animals not to come onto the road well, but then provide some kind of movement over or under a section. There are things called jump outs. California, we're behind a little bit. There's been great progress in the last few years, but states like Colorado, having been to Colorado several times, you're driving up the main stretch out of there, out of Denver, and you will see that there's a section that is approximately 14 miles long that has a jump out about every 100 to 150 feet. And that was put in by the Colorado Department of Transportation to keep animals off the highways. And then if they do get onto the highways, they have a place to jump out so they don't get stuck. This is really important because it improves human protection because less accidents. So reducing the human wildlife interaction, the animals get to see another day. So please, of all the things you do today, and if you're not in California, please check resources in your state about how you can report roadkill, because every transportation agency identifies problematic stretches of road for wildlife movement based upon roadkill data. Last one, this goes back to modifying fences. I don't have a suggestion for this, and I am certainly not attempting to frustrate anyone who knows that they need privacy fences, but there needs to be solutions. And we need to think as a scientific group and a community what we can do and where we can place fences, how we can modify them. I was on a site visit and I heard something, and I watched a group of deer run about 40 feet behind me, but then there was a straggler, and he was disturbed, or she was disturbed by my presence. And this is what happened. Tried to get away. Come on. Nope. Nope. Got to go back. Here we go. Oh, it's not. There we go. He just stopped at the fence. He was bounding, bounding, bounding. They were bounding, bounding, bounding. And then it encountered this fence that it couldn't jump, and it stopped. And then as I went to turn away, it actually jumped over that fence and then couldn't get back over. And a warden was kind enough to go find it later, and it had eventually gotten out of the yard. But every one of those situations could be a broken leg. It could expose the landowner to increase wildlife conflict. And these are all the things we're trying to avoid. Now I have to go back. Sorry, everybody. Please forgive me. Okay. So for this, I thought I'd put together a little show and tell. Birds. I wanted us to think about what are the animals that live in our immediate surroundings? What are those that may just be moving through? And I was a little surprised by some of this. So let's just start with the avian species. So these are ones that are here on the coast. I put daily feet and miles. You'll see why in a few minutes. But Anna's hummingbird. It'll go 1 to 2 miles a day. For a little bird, that's pretty impressive. But it also means how much energy is that bird expending to be able to do that. Stellar jay, its range is smaller than the hummingbird, and Cooper's hawk, that is more of a woodland edge species, 1 to 3 miles. Bald eagle, it's going for it. It's going 2 to 6 miles. Common raven, up to almost 8 miles a day. Great horned owl, great blue heron, acorn woodpecker, and the song sparrow. These are all averaging anywhere from like 1,000 feet to a couple of miles. And think about birds' movement's easier, but they're looking for cover and they're looking for food. And if we're not, some of these ranges are because they can't find adequate food sources. So if we provide better food sources for them, then it certainly reduces stress upon them. Mammals, snow retrieval, small little species, doesn't go very far, and it typically stays up in the trees in contiguous tree canopy. You lose the contiguous tree canopy, then you tend to lose the species because it travels from the canopies. It doesn't, come down to the ground and then go back up in another tree. But it could spend most of most of its life in your yard. Raccoons, they wander a little bit more, but we know about those guys, right? But same thing. Long-tailed weasel, which is a species we have here, is pretty cryptic, stays well hidden, but that's even less than a mile. Ringtail cat, fully protected species in California. I actually didn't think that they necessarily were here, even though the range map shows that they are. But a fellow biologist told me that they had seen one on their property just south of Fort Bragg. That was so exciting. Ringtail cats, they look a little bit like lemurs, which I find fascinating that it has a ringtail and is a cat, but they're here. Their numbers dropped dramatically because of their fur was used. So a little bit of a surprise, but awesome. Black bears. Notice that the black bear doesn't go much farther than the ringtail cat, and certainly not much further than the raccoon. River otters, and I will admit I wasn't able to find out if this is river miles or terrestrial miles, but they're busy, they're feisty, they got things to go do. They're up a little bit more. But notice that our deer don't go as far as that river otter. And then the bobcat, which you would think is ranging major miles, up to 3 miles a day, maybe. Mountain lions, they tend to be a little more. Their home ranges are larger, just naturally. I think it's 100 square miles, 10 square miles, which is 100. Not that big though. Roosevelt elk, massive creatures, primarily up on the Lost Coast, 3 miles. Tule elk, which tend to be more of a wetland meadow elk, more like 4 miles. And then I want to talk just for a moment about our smaller little guys, back to like say a wood rat. Wood rats may spend a good portion of their life on your property or nearby your property, and they're not foraging that far, but notice they forage up to a mile. So something like a road or a fence, if it can't climb the fence, it's certainly going to be a challenge to get across the road. So every road becomes a barrier, which makes a smaller island for the further all of these species have to roam. With the exception of hoary bat flying, nocturnal species, but also note they're not going that far. They, of course, are feeding primarily on things like insects and mosquitoes, but I had thought that they would be much further, which tells me that they have more of a niche habitat. And when that niche habitat is lost or degraded in some way, then that means that one should also expect that the abundance of that species will be lower. Save this one for last. Amphibians are near and dear to my heart. Also, is the one that pretty much made me want to really focus on this idea of our yards and regenerating habitat for the species that do live here. Western garter snake, I have a few in the yard, 500 feet. Our little slender salamanders, 200 feet. That's about the maximum that they're going to move in a day. Western pond turtle, a little further. Some of this has to do with finding mates and reproduction and foraging. But our northern red-legged frog, 200 feet. It's going to go into the stream system, or if it's a certain time of year, it may be out in the banks, burrowed down. It doesn't go far. Please note the Pacific, coarse frog, who seems to be everywhere, can range up to 1,500 feet. That was a little surprising too, because that means that species probably has a more diverse ability to live across different habitat types, not just more specialized. Northern fence lizard, who doesn't love a good, fence lizard, 3,000 feet. Northern rubber boa, less than half a mile. coastal tail frog, which like clean, fast, cold water here on the coast. At most, it's going 1,500 feet. But for the most part, it stays closer to home, as do most of these amphibians. Same for foothill yellows. And then our southern torrent salamander, because I don't want to forget the rest of our salamanders, 7 feet. It's done for the day. I moved, I got my lunch, and now I'm going home. That means that its habitat, my yard is its entire world. For many of these amphibian species, it is. And as I do restoration actions on my yard by pulling English ivy, by cutting back the broom, I am seeing an uptick in not only the diversity of species, but the abundance of them. And when I realize that I do have these species, I do attempt to make improvements for them, recognizing their contribution to the food web and recognizing what I can contribute to their habitat, which then contributes to the much greater biodiversity system. Last but not least, be an advocate. All the things I've talked about before, maybe you're not into it. Maybe you're too busy. No shade on that. We all have struggled to find enough time in our days. Maybe you weren't able to go volunteer at JDSF and pull invasive species. That's fine too. But everything you do does make a difference when you engage and become an advocate. So first and foremost, our host for tonight, the Noyo Marine Center, who, as I had mentioned to our host tonight, I intend to volunteer and become one of their docents and assist in any way that they need. They're an amazing organization that not only does science, but also really pulls in the community for the benefit of this very unique ecosystem that they study, which is our marine. Mendocino Land Trust, if you check their social media pages, they will put a call for volunteers. They have very standard times for beach cleanups, and then sometimes there's planting opportunities, and they also have some citizen science opportunities. The Fort Bragg Gardening Club, fantastic resource. They do plant sales, and yes, they do like their ornamentals, but they've also started to really like their natives, and I'm extremely proud of that and very thrilled for that they're considering how landscaping in downtown, how this can help regenerate biodiversity through the planting of appropriately local native plants. The Mendocino Coast Botanical Gardens, no, it's not all native. I think we all know that, right? They're from all over the place, but there's some really great habitats that if you want to go learn your species, it's a great place to take your phone, look at the species, be able to, use an app on your phone to see what the species are, and then also to go look at some species that aren't that great, that could live here, but probably shouldn't outside of the botanic gardens. They have plenty of volunteer opportunities, and also the Mendocino Coast Audubon Society does a monthly walk out on the botanical gardens. That is a great way to learn more of your species. Jackson State Forest, CAL FIRE, they have individual running their social media accounts that is really forward, trying to pull in the community to get more time out on JDSF. And one of the ways to do that is to come pull invasive species, including broom. They did an action not too long ago, and my understanding they'll start it up again in the fall. California State Parks, lots of opportunities to volunteer. And because we live in a remote place, we all know that there aren't enough volunteers to get everything done that needs to get done. So every bit helps. Last but not least is the Dorothy King Young chapter of the California Native Plant Society. So the people I respect most on the coast belong to this society. And they are consultants, they are teachers, and they are plant enthusiasts who want to see not only restoration on these sensitive natural communities like the Mendocino cypress woodland, but also who host plant sales. And you can get their plant list before and go see what native plants you're going to spend your paycheck on. And it's a fantastic cause to support. And they also put out a quarterly newsletter that's incredibly informative. Can't say enough about the local chapter, but maybe that's not your thing either. So talk about a few opportunities for citizen science. The Zurich Society they sponsor Bee City USA. Fort Bragg is a Bee City USA. You can go to the website. There's lots of different things. This month it's No May Mow, which is the idea of don't mow your lawn. They're actually saying that perhaps the newest science is only mow twice a year. I don't know if I'm going to go that crazy, but the idea that if you just not mow as short, you're providing habitat for those native insects, particularly in the earlier spring. Check out Bee City. And then again, Homegrown National Park, Doug Talmy, this is an initiative that he started. We can regrow our biodiversity by recreating native habitats with something like Homegrown National Park, hence why it's called National Park. I ask all of you to check it out. They're great resources, and even better, there are resources that point you back to more local resources for California and for our area. But maybe that's not your thing either. So one of the things is, again, become an advocate. Carefully, thoughtfully talk to our local nurseries and ask why they aren't carrying more natives, or what cultivars from natives are appropriate to plant. And also, why are we selling invasive species? The world does not need any more eucalyptus. I have plenty in my backyard. Say maybe that's not your thing either. Well, city of Fort Bragg, city of Point Arena, Mendocino County, these are all under CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, lead agencies for projects. You can approach any of them and say, hey, have any of you guys ever considered creating a landscaping list or plan for those of us who live in your jurisdiction to be able to use to identify the plants to grow here? Do you have any plants that you would recommend? Do you have a list? And then the next step to that is become an advocate, be involved, and start commenting, if you would like, on projects that they are lead agency for. Why aren't, such and such is being built, all these non-native plants are going in, or worse, invasives. Are they aware that they're invasives? Go have a conversation, get involved, and show your passion for these species to sustain, and also address the fact that you may be concerned that some of these non-natives or invasives that would be planted could escape onto state parks land, onto your land, onto your neighbor's land. And then where are we going to be? It's a positive role to become involved in these entities that are also lobbying for policy change. And that can be done through the state, that can be done at this local level. The symbol, by the way, with the bear is for the road ecology. There's this whole other side to it that we need citizen scientists beyond posting photos on iNaturalist. We need citizen science to tell us where resources are if there is a concern. So NOAA and CDFW both have monitoring programs, and I believe the NOAA Center does too, where you can volunteer and go out and do surveys and then report back to these agencies about what you found. It's a great way to get involved. It's a great way to learn your community. And one of the NOAA Center volunteers, actually, she takes me on her beach survey north of town. And it's the best part of my weekends when I go with her. And so that's documenting what species have washed up on the shore, and then also looking for invasive species and also rarer species, which is fantastic. There is something for all of you to do if you want to, you personally, to contribute to not only keeping what we have, but then also being able to regenerate. And some of that is policy. And let me see if it's on this slide. Nope. So the Native Plant Society, it's also in the link, and I provided as a PDF in the chat. The Native Plant Society has started an advocacy group. And so you can go to their website, and the first meeting is May 28th. And the part of the first meeting is about how do you become an advocate? How do you use your voice to advocate for policy changes that will positively affect everything we've talked about: invasive species control, planting native species, improving wildlife movement, all of this. And so it really comes down to anything you choose to do off of these proposed steps today will make a difference. It'll make a big difference for our coast, for our species, and eventually for our human health. Diverse biodiversity or a diverse landscape benefits one of the species that live within it, which is also us. So our takeaway message again, everybody, increase island sizes by planting native species, removing invasives to keep our common species common, and then act locally. Think about the rest of it, but act locally because you will make an impact. Again, how do you eat that elephant? One bite at a time. So with that, I would like to thank you for attending. Here's a shot of the Noyo River facing upstream, and then one of my second favorite native, which is a Douglas iris.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was super. That's so much incredible information. And I, for one, will not look at my yard quite the same when I go out there tomorrow morning. But I think the takeaway is definitely that we can all do a lot to contribute to so many things that keep the diversity of our native species intact and hopefully increase awareness in that. I just want to thank you again, Jennifer, for your time and all the work that went into your presentation. Is really, really great. We appreciate it.
Thank you. I just want to confirm if everyone could see the resources in the chat, if you can download them. Lots of information there for you to use. And also, again, thank you to the Noyo Center. If you have additional topics or want to drill into any of these and have me back, I'd always love that.